Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is all about supporting employees who are working and living with chronic health conditions. We're going to do some introductions in a moment, but just to manage some housekeeping before we dive into the content. The session is being recorded, and an edited version of this is going to be shared on our YouTube channel in due course, and then I'll be sharing a link to that on all of the platforms so you can revisit it or share the link with colleagues in your network who you think might be interested. We'll also be sharing the slides that we walk through after the event. And please, at any time, drop your questions for Rachel or I into the webinar chat. I'll keep an eye on that as we go through, and we'll pause regularly to address your questions. And we're making reference to some resources as we go through this, but one of the key places you can find out about those resources is on our website at worklifepsych.com/psychological flexibility. But don't worry about remembering that. We'll share it again a little bit later on. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Richard. I've been doing what I do for over 20 years now. I'm a workplace psychologist, and my focus is on helping people be their best selves at work by boosting and maintaining their well-being, their productivity, their interpersonal effectiveness. And I started this business, Work Life Psych, 10 years ago next month. So brace yourself for lots of self-promotion about that, actually in September. So you can find out all about us and what we do via the links on screen there. I'm going to introduce my colleague Rachel now.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm Dr. Rachael Skews. I work with Work Life Psych as a associate. I'm a chartered coaching psychologist, as you'll see on there. I do a lot of supervision and training for coaches, and I also help organizations to design interventions. And one of the reasons that Richard kindly invited me to come and talk on this webinar is I did some work when we were looking at how we could support individuals who've got chronic health conditions. So I'll hopefully be able to bring some of that learning and experience into the conversation today and talk a little bit about that. The areas that I really specialise in are performance, well-being, and health. So
Thank you. So what are we going to cover today? We'll start with the basics. What are these chronic health conditions, and why is this so important to recognize them and consider the impact that they're having on employees and their experience of the workplace, or not, as we'll see. Rachel's going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of these conditions and what that means for our understanding of people's experience of work. And then we'll have a look at how organizations and line managers can support these employees. Our emphasis is on flexibility and accommodations, and that kind of intervention benefits everyone, really. But we want to target some specific things. Rachel is going to talk to us about one specific intervention, one specific way of supporting them, which is acceptance and commitment coaching. And that evidence-based approach to coaching is a really good fit for many of these employees living with these chronic health conditions for a number of reasons, which we'll explain a little bit later. And then I'll wrap us up by talking about what it is that we can do and have done for individuals, teams, and organizations. So let's kick off. Reminder, your questions at any point in the webinar chat. I'll be looking over regularly to see what you have to say. So what are these chronic health conditions? There's no agreed perfect definition of this, but the kinds of things that we're talking about are long-term, and they are physical and or psychological diagnosed conditions. One really important point with these is that they are not always visible or obvious to others. And this can have a real impact on someone's experience of living with them and their experience of the workplace. We know that conditions that aren't visible or open to others can lead people to mask or to feel levels of shame and guilt when their condition does interfere with their capacity to do their work, and makes it one bit more difficult for them to raise it in conversation anyway. One of the other things is that the impact of these conditions can come and go. It's not a straight line. So someone's condition, for example, something like irritable bowel disorder or Crohn's disease, that can flare up and then symptoms can go away again. So we're not talking about something necessarily that's permanently there. And this means that these conversations may need to happen on a regular basis and not a one and done basis. It's really important that there is access to support, the conversation about what's needed as early as possible so that someone is neither working through a flare up of their illness or working in a way that is exacerbating their experience of this condition. Some of them we know can result in temporary or even long-term exclusion from the workforce, either because the flexibility that's required isn't there, or something like the comorbidity with another challenge. So maybe a physical health condition, and their experience of that is now associated with another psychological condition, which is making access to the workforce more difficult. And so with any of these, we can't just look at them in isolation, and we have to take a perspective that accounts for either comorbidity of multiple conditions at the same time and or the intersectional nature of this. We are not our chronic conditions. We experience them, but we also have a multitude of other aspects to our identity and our experience of the workplace. So it is complex. It's not just one or two things that can be done for all of these conditions or all of these employees. So it requires some thought. And my theory is that is what makes it particularly difficult because it's not sort of checklist approach. But that is also why it is so important for this to be high on the agenda for those people in organizations who have responsibility for well-being, but also for recruitment and learning and development and all of the other aspects of the workplace that are so important to team and organizational functioning. I want to share some examples, and they are only examples. This is by no means a finite list, but the reason I'm flagging these is I want you to consider, and Rachel, please jump in at any point, consider what this could mean for someone's experience of the workplace and the kinds of flexibility that could really benefit them. And first of all, flagging a couple of psychological conditions. Again, these aren't going to be necessarily visible to others through how you present physically, and unless they're discussed, unless someone is open about that, colleagues, line manager may not necessarily know. And also, like many psychological conditions, the manifestation of symptoms and the difficulties people experience are not a straight line. They can be exacerbated on a periodic basis. There's a whole category of musculoskeletal disorders that can interfere with someone's ability to do the physical aspects of work. And that includes simply sitting for long periods of time or being mobile, moving from one place to another, or indeed things like lifting and carrying and use of computer equipment, all the way from long-term chronic back pain through to the illnesses that are maybe acquired in the workplace, like repetitive strain injuries and so on. I referenced Crohn's disease and irritable bowel disorders, and this is an umbrella term for again what is for many people an invisible condition. So unless they speak about this, no one is going to know about it. And the challenges with discussing these in particular have lessened slightly over the years, but there's still a stigma associated with these. There's a lot of misunderstandings about these as well. We don't have, necessarily control over how these manifest, but they can result in things like fatigue, as well as not being able to leave the home or needing to be very near a bathroom and taking frequent bathroom breaks, which may be obvious to those around them and can make life particularly difficult in terms of the logistics of work, travel for work, concentration for work. COPD and the impact that that has on capacity for movement and travel, lifting, carrying, all of these kinds of things, the physical aspects. Diabetes and its long-term impact on not only um, the physical health, but sometimes the self-concept and how people feel about themselves and how much disorders, conditions like this take up space in their identity. Endometriosis, and the pain, the chronic pain and life disruption that comes with that can come between um, a very standard 9 to 5 routine in the workplace, making things like being able to pay attention, manage emotions, give due attention to what's right in front of you, and a need to take absence from the workplace, which applies to lots of these. And without an open discussion about these, people can find themselves in those conversations, which are not about care, but are about performance management because an arbitrary level of absence has been reached. And finally, just by way of example, is arthritis, which is a very good example of where symptoms that can interfere with our functioning can flare up and go down and make even the simplest of work tasks more complex, such as using computer equipment or even commuting. Not a finite list, but I want us to start thinking at this point about the way that these conditions can make everyday tasks in the workplace a little bit more difficult. Rachel, anything to throw in at this point?
No, I think this is just giving a sense of the breadth of conditions that would be covered under this umbrella term of chronic health conditions. And also just to really highlight again that a lot of these, unless people disclose that they have, pain or that they have discomfort or that there's a behavioral impact on them, like you were saying, if people have got IBDs or Crohn's disease, they may not feel comfortable saying, this is affecting how I am at work in terms of wanting to be near a toilet. Some of the others around not wanting to work. So, sorry, not wanting to travel for work. And I think it's important to notice that, these are not necessarily things that will be obvious to people when they look at an individual to know that they have a chronic health condition. And a lot of people, if they're uncomfortable to disclose, they may not, they may never actually, talk to people about this at work. So I think this is also about creating more of an inclusive environment within the workplace, because if what you're interested in is, getting the best performance out of every single employee and helping them to really achieve their potential, creating an environment which is inclusive and feels safe for people to disclose and talk about chronic health conditions, that could be really valuable.
There's another aspect to this, of course, which is if we're able to do everything that Rachel's just been talking about, we'll be able to have all of the other conversations that are really important to have at work that are not necessarily about a chronic condition, but could be about relationships at work, performance at work, all of the other stuff that benefits from clarity and open communication. So this was my earlier point about the kinds of accessibility and flexibility and focus that we place on this will benefit everybody in the longer run. I'll hand over to Rachel at this point to talk about
Yeah.
the prevalence of these conditions.
Well, I think this is just the perfect place to take the discussion next, because a lot of people, like we said, you won't even know if they are not disclosing to you that they have chronic pain, for example, or that they have any of those other conditions that we've been just discussing. So this is data just from the UK. The data globally is not hugely different. But I wanted to use an actual kind of, census data from the UK. So this was published in 22 and it covers the period from 2019 to 2020. So it just gives you a flavour of what the picture looks like using the UK as an example. So within this data, there's about 75% of the UK population that during this period reported being in good health. So they consider themselves to be in good health. But we also have nearly half of the population, depending on whether you look at the split between men and women, almost half who will report having a long-standing health problem. So what this means is we're not talking about something which is acute that needs hospitalization or that might really disrupt somebody's kind of day-to-day life. These are conditions that people are living with, and that, as Richard said, there may be flare-ups, but these are things that people are kind of, they're part of their day-to-day lived experience. And I think that's really important to remember. If we are talking about acute health, quite often that will mean people can't work or, they may not be able to engage in work in a kind of, meaningful way, the same way that we can when we're well. But chronic health conditions they are by definition, they are chronic. They're there pretty much all of the time. People might have had them from birth or just from a very long period. And so this is something which I think it's really valuable within the workplace to create that inclusivity around. We know that being in work really gives people that sense of meaning and purpose. It's great to be able to contribute to something. Being out of work or unemployed is actually quite unhelpful for us a lot of the time. It's a necessity for some people. But one of the things that I think is important when we think about chronic health in the workplace is making work conditions more inclusive to people who are living with a chronic condition. Going down onto that next bullet point, of those individuals, some reported being limited in activities, but not severely because of that health problem in the last 6 months. So there's a number of people who will be living with a chronic health condition, about half of the population. And perhaps, again, about half of those may be limited in their activity because of that health condition over a period of 6 months. So what the picture we're seeing is that the majority of people living with a chronic health condition, it's allowing them to still have a fairly normal day-to-day life, and they probably will be in work. Those individuals will be in work. So this is going to be going on in our workplace. Another side to this is not only those individuals who are living with and experiencing a chronic health condition themselves, but this data also show that around 20% of the UK population are providing informal care or assistance to somebody else. And this data is saying that often that's a family member, so a child, a partner, a parent. So it's not just the individuals in the workplace who are living with that chronic health condition themselves, but it's also that we have people within our society who are providing care to others in their family. And that may also be something that is worth a good conversation in the workplace. I've coached quite a few senior leaders, and one of the big things they've been talking about is their caring responsibilities and the impact that that's having on them at work. And, I think it's something which, as we move more into having this conversation, I think making space not only for reasonable adjustments for individuals themselves, but also what do we need to do? How do we need to adjust our work practices so that we make it more inclusive for those who are providing care?
And the practicalities around this are where our focus ideally should be. Awareness is fantastic, but practically, what does this mean for people? And I
Yeah,
think in our experience, it's often quite simple and small adjustments that can make a really big difference for people's experience of the workplace.
yeah,
And that's what I'd like to turn to next. What is it that organizations can do, either structurally from the leadership down or on a more informal or casual basis with a line manager, extending some flexibility? This isn't just for chronic health conditions, but we really need to consider job design and be intentional with that. Later this year, I'm going to be running a campaign around well-being in the workplace. And one of the key messages I want to share, no spoilers, is actually we need to move from looking at symptoms to actually creating good work and having well-designed jobs that humans can actually do and not feel like they only have sort of one nostril above the water level at all times. So when we think about how people can benefit from effective job design, it's that anyone could benefit from well-designed jobs and that they're periodically reviewed. Because what we all know from roles is that they tend to expand over time in terms of responsibility and workload. And that we need to keep an eye on that. But we also know that the kinds of flexibility that people can benefit from uh, need not be, shall we say, disruptive from the organization's perspective. One example I came across in my own coaching practice that has stayed with me for quite some time was someone whose arthritis would get worse. The symptoms would flare up on a periodic basis. And the flexibility that they benefited from was being able to get a less busy train a little bit later in the morning so they could get a seat. That's all they needed. And that's what they were able to get. And it made all the difference. So we're not talking about huge reorganizations. We're talking about considering the individual, which is a big part of management, let's be honest. Again, another big message I want to share later in the year and expand upon is when we think about well-being at work, what do we mean by that? But if we're going to do something organized, like a well-being program, an initiative, we need to make sure that we're doing that with an inclusive mindset. So not unintentionally excluding people who are working from home or not arranging events that require travel and unintentionally excluding people whose chronic health condition makes that more difficult or is a needless additional stressor on them. And not arranging events that require people to do things outside the scope of their job that maybe require hours outside of the working day. That could be framed as something like it's team building, it's getting to know you. That can easily be an additional stressor on someone who looks forward to leaving on time so they can rest and recover from the day. But also considering the plethora of conditions that could make being present in an event during working hours more challenging if it's 2 hours, 3 hours long. They might just need that flexibility to take a break, move around. But these are things that humans need, full stop. So when we think about introducing these well-being initiatives, we don't just want to think about our super healthy, able-bodied colleagues. We want to consider everyone who's there and how chronic health conditions might make it a little bit difficult or even off-putting to be part of that.
Now, I was just going to say, when we've been talking about how common they are, I think sometimes within organizations, we think, oh, this is a very niche need for a very small group of people. But the data suggest that this is actually maybe 1 in 2 people in the population. So within an organization, there will probably be a large percentage of the workforce for whom some level of reasonable adjustment or inclusivity would actually have a massive benefit.
Absolutely. This is what really motivated me to really start this conversation, which was to me, it's a large and neglected group in the workplace. Now, it is difficult for organizations to consider everybody, but chronic health conditions sort of cross all of those pre-existing boundaries and ways of splitting the data and are incredibly common. So I would really like leaders, managers, HR professionals to start considering this as well as all of the other things. So these reasonable adjustments, these small changes really benefit a lot of these employees, but they benefit anyone.
Yeah.
Small examples of flexibility, small adjustments to the way the job is designed, or the requirements for the role holder can make a huge difference. And organizations tend to get that investment back multiple times from employees who really appreciate that and can be their best selves at work.
Agreed. And I think going on to that next point around manager training, being able to support managers to have those conversations because they're more likely to have employees disclosing to them if they create that safe environment.
Absolutely. And I tend to recommend it to my clients when designing a well-being program that there's a track for managers to take part in, which involves having conversations like this, being able to respond to questions about this in an effective way and not in an embarrassed way or an awkward way or in an emotional way, because for many people, for many managers, they will put personal health in a different category. I don't want to know about that. That's something that's your business. But actually, we're one person and we bring this stuff to work as well.
Yeah.
Um, when we have benefits from a well-being perspective, now whether they're evidence-based or not is a whole other topic that we're going to look at later in the year. But we need to consider, are these things beneficial to everybody? Or are we unintentionally excluding some people or making it less appropriate to them because of the condition that they're living with? And ensuring that we don't unintentionally shame someone or make them feel they're letting the team down by utilizing that flexibility. Whether it's visible toilet breaks or increased flexibility in their working hours or reduced time at a desk for a period of time. Open discussions and management skills can ensure that people don't feel that they're carrying the team and that there is a level of fairness. Because as we say, the reasonable adjustments can work for everybody. It's more for managers to do, but it can really contribute to team effectiveness.
Mm. I
We
think
really
as well,
want
it's worth making the point again that these are not just uh, initiatives or adjustments that will, address a chronic health condition. It's actually creating the right environment for getting the best performance out of every single person in the organization. And I don't mean that in the cracking the whip and, working people till they fall over. It's about creating a sustainable environment for high performance, one in which every individual is given those, small adjustments that they might need in order to really work at their best. This is a massive win-win, in my humble opinion.
I'm going to agree, and I'm also going to ask everyone to consider conditions on a continuum from, chronic conditions that are disruptive to routines and can make life really difficult for people, but they can still and want to uh, work, all the way through to acute annoyances to our health, getting a head cold, having a really bad night's sleep due to something. This same adjustment, being told, look, come in a little bit later, or work from home today, or skip that meeting and focus on this instead. That's the kind of agile, flexible management that people really benefit from, whether it is something that's they're not going to have more than once in a year or something that they're living with. But when someone says, I've got a head cold, there's very little shame or stigma attached to that. When someone says, I'm living with this, and it makes these things more difficult for me, people can feel that. And that's why it's difficult to raise these topics in the first place. So let's move on to one of the ways, in addition to these sort of high level points, that we know can be really beneficial and evidence-based intervention, uh, acceptance and commitment coaching. Over to you, Rachel.
Oh. Yeah, so in acceptance and commitment coaching, if you have come across me and my work before, you may have heard me talking about this. It's something I talk about a lot. I know Richard does too. Um, it started off as an approach within the therapeutic space. So, acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, it's starting to become much better known within the workplace because one of the things that this approach was developed to do was to really understand not just when things go wrong, but what does human functioning look like across the board. Now, that's kind of unusual from some of the other psychological therapeutic approaches, which were a little bit more focused on, when there is, real acute problems that people are dealing with. So ACT was developed with a slightly different intention, which is just to understand how is it that we function? How do our minds work? How can we understand that and then use that information and knowledge to actually be able to help people, not just when things are not going well or there's an acute mental health need, but also how can we use that to understand and prevent mental health issues? Or how can we help people who are performing in very challenging environments? How can we protect them psychologically? How can we help people to really perform at their best? So you'll see ACT now filtering through into lots and lots of different areas. It's very commonly used with chronic health, chronic pain, some of those different areas. And we're using it very effectively in the workplace as well in order to understand what high functioning environments look like. Now, isn't it interesting? It took me working within mental health, chronic health, and with my background as an occupational psychologist to see the connection between these different things and the epiphany that is actually all of these environments, it's the same. The environments that we create for high performance are also the environments that improve well-being. So I think that's a really important point when you think about this from an organizational context. It is an evidence-based approach to coaching. It's been tested in a variety of different contexts in the workplace and specifically within coaching. And what we see is this main factor that we're targeting in acceptance and commitment coaching, which is called psychological flexibility, which I think, Richard, you're going to dive into that
Mhm.
shortly and talk about that in a bit more detail. So I'll just give a really high level sense of what psychological flexibility is. Um, it's your ability to notice what's really important. So you're kind of creating a little bit of more awareness, and that might be a bit of self-awareness, it might be a bit of situational awareness, being able to notice what's going on for you, what might be going on around you, but also being in touch with what really matters. And we talk about that as being values. And being able to keep that focus on what matters and not kind of getting hijacked by you know, different fears that we might have, or different thoughts that we might have, or, different. We were just talking about how important supporting our team can be. So, for example, in this situation, somebody may not want to talk about a chronic health condition and the need that that creates for them because they don't want to let the team down. So we can be driven by these various different things, but actually, once somebody understands that if I get a slightly different environment, I'll be able to support the team better. That's engaging their psychological flexibility. That's being able to notice that thought is not helpful. There is something important that I want to do here. I want to support the team. How can I best do that? What is the most workable thing for me longer term? Sometimes we get hijacked because we want to fix things in the short term. So this is really about saying what's going to be sustainable, what's going to work better in the longer term, what's going to have the better impact overall. So we've got this real emphasis on doing more of what matters. And that within the workplace is not just for the individual, it's also for the team and the organization. So it's this really, you can have these really big, rich conversations around what does that look like for us? What is it that matters to us in this moment? There could be some big challenges that an organization is working towards, some big goals for the year, and being able to pull together and understanding again, how do we achieve that in a really workable way that's going to be quite inclusive to people and is going to allow everybody to work towards that most effectively. One of the great things about acceptance and commitment coaching and all of the other ways in which we apply acceptance and commitment theory is that these are skills and they are skills that we can develop. So every single skill that we identify within the ACT model and psychological flexibility itself, that's something that we can develop, we can increase it. And there's a really good set of interventions, and there's many, many more that, you can get creative with. How are we going to develop this with people? But that's what's really important about this. It's not something that you have or you don't have. This is something that you can develop. It's a skill, and it's a skill that we can all develop. It's really helpful at the individual level. So for you as a person, increasing your psychological flexibility, that's probably going to be helpful at work. Happily, it's also helpful in your relationships. And it's also helpful in terms of, your own health and well-being, looking after yourself well. But when we start to scale these things up in an organizational context, you do get these lovely knock-on effects as well. That's what the data is kind of the early data showing, is that you then get, greater psychological flexibility across the organization too, and across, managers. So something that is worth, in my opinion, I am of course very biased. It's something that I'm both quite passionate about, if you've not picked that up already. But again, really good value in terms of the benefits and the impact that this kind of approach can have within an organization. And some of the outcomes, there are many, and the research is quite, it's starting to create a quite cohesive picture across a real variety of different contexts. But what we see in the workplace is that using acceptance and commitment coaching, increasing people's psychological flexibility, it really does support people's well-being, their resilience, but also their performance at work as well. Anything you want to add, Richard?
I was just going to say that what we've got next is just an overview of the skills that you and I help people develop. If you want to just elaborate on
Yeah.
those a little bit.
Yeah, so we've talked a little bit about being really kind of in touch with what matters. And so we sometimes refer to that as values, but really what's important is getting clarity and connection with the things that matter. That's actually really helpful on an individual level. There's almost something um, beneficial about being in contact with those things. And I often say to people, if you're not sure what really matters to you, think about why is it that you do the job that you do? What are the things that get you out of bed on a morning? Maybe if you're not hugely fulfilled at work, what is it outside of work that really matters to you? And often it will be like, I don't know about you, Richard. One of the things that really matters to me is contributing to the coaching community, whether that's through presenting, doing webinars like this, helping people within workplaces to reflect on and learn about how they can create better environments, more functional environments where people can be at their best. Like that gets me out of bed in the morning. That's what matters to me. I've also talked a little bit about how important it is that we are able to kind of get into that awareness of what's going on. And that could be what's going on internally. So, what kind of thoughts or feelings are you having? And some of them are going to be great and they're going to really, boost you. And some of them could be quite challenging. And that's normal. We all have that. Also thinking about, what's going on around me, what's situational awareness as well. So we talk very much about this focus on the present moment, being able to get aware of what's going on internally and externally, being in touch with that, even when that could be quite challenging for a variety of different reasons. I like the way that this is phrased, the ending of an internal struggle. So this is about being able to kind of, when you notice that there is a difficult thought or feeling, perhaps being able to make space for it. It sounds very counterintuitive, but often those difficult thoughts and feelings, let's think again about that team context. You don't want to let your colleagues down. So you can sometimes feel that sense of discomfort if you are letting them down and you want to push that away or you want to get rid of that. Actually, sometimes having a difficult conversation is the best way of supporting the team or being able to contribute to the team. When we're talking about a chronic health condition that somebody might be dealing with. So being able to create space for these thoughts or feelings that we might have that we might not like, but actually they're there for a good reason because we care about things. That's what I notice. And I don't know if you're the same, Richard, but a lot of the time when I'm coaching people or working with people and we're talking about these internal struggles, like they're coming from a place of caring and things being important to us.
Because it matters, you know,
'Cause
and that sort of automatic pushing them away or trying to suppress them or somehow change them. If you just think about your own experience as a human being, the very first thing that does is takes you away from that present moment where you could be doing something. It takes you up into your mind. And then that can lead to all other kinds of struggles. But ultimately, it's not going to serve you well to try and control your thoughts and feelings like that.
Yeah. And it just doesn't make sense. Often when you dive into it, you realize, oh, I feel like that because I really care about this situation. There's something important to me here. So that leads us nicely on to the next one, which is there's probably going to be, in some way, shape, or form, a need to accept feeling uncomfortable or feeling a level of discomfort. Now, usually this is because the things that feel comfortable to us, we just crack on. Often, where where I tend to do a lot of my work as a coach is helping people to do something different when that feels harder. So the advice, unfortunately, is that when you feel that internal struggle, there's probably a little bit of discomfort that's going to come along for the ride because there's going to be something that feels hard to do, but could be really worth it, could have a very positive and beneficial impact, like having a difficult conversation. Flexibility and self-concept, I wonder if people often find that a little bit of an odd one, but really what we're talking about there is that sometimes we have these different beliefs or stories that we're carrying around about ourselves, and they can be quite limiting. I often think as well, when we think about it in terms of chronic health, I think sometimes the health condition can become a really integral part of us and really start to drive our behavior. And one of the things that can be helpful is for people to be guided to take a step back from it and, really be able to think about themselves. So there is the condition in the room, but they are also a human being who is much, much more than, whatever that chronic health condition or their lived experience of chronic health is. So I think it's a valuable exercise that you can do alongside all of these other skills that we're talking about here in terms of reminding ourselves that we are very, very beautifully complex things. We are multifaceted. And sometimes a health condition can kind of take over a little bit. So being able to take that step back and think about what really matters. I think in the workplace, people being able to engage in work that they really care about, working with colleagues that they care about, that's a really helpful environment. So again, another reason to make sure we're making these workplaces as inclusive as we can and engaging people as much as we can, because that's really helpful. It's a really good thing for us as humans. And finally, the one thing that really matters the most is acting on what matters, being able to be that person that we want to be, being able to take action towards the things that we really care about. So I'll stop there. Do you want to add anything to that?
Just a couple of things. One, the link at the bottom of the slide there will take you to a page that outlines all of these in more detail and a recent podcast series I did with Ross McIntosh from the People Soup podcast, who's another ACT practitioner. And just coming back to the self-concept bit, I find this is hugely important in this space particularly. I
Mhm.
have a regular experience with coaches, mid-career, let's say, who will say things like, I'm no good with numbers. And we'll explore that. And it will come from an episode in their primary school where they had some off the cuff feedback from a teacher and it's just stuck with them. Now, if that can happen, imagine how well-being, health, illness, team functioning are spoken about at work and how someone could so easily internalize loose messaging, unhelpful words, and start to internalize that I am, I'm not, I can, I can't, or I'll never be able to X. So this just reiterates that all of us are made of millions of data points. But when we are inflexible about some of it, it's a little bit like wearing a badge. That is me. I am X. And of course, we're all more than one thing. And
Yeah.
and that's what I want to elaborate on next is like how specifically can these help employees who are living with these conditions? Rachel, you were going to say something there.
I was only going to say that in the work that I've done with chronic health conditions, and that was supporting individuals with chronic health conditions, as opposed to the organizations supporting them, the their identity, the identity piece there, the flexibility and self-concept, that time and time again came up as such an important part of the conversation because, as I said, we really, it was almost like it took over and it became the main identity, like the way they identified, because it was just, prevalent within their life. Now, I was working with people who had quite severe chronic health conditions, so that might be part of it. But I just think that that's something which is really helpful for us to think about is, reminding if you have a chronic health condition, reminding yourself that you are so much more than that, and really helping you to get back in touch with some of those other things that may feel more difficult to connect with because of that health condition. But I also think within organizations, remembering that somebody might be in that space where this is, this is a huge part of their lives. And work is a really important other factor that it's actually very beneficial for, for us to be together and contributing to the work that we do. So I think from both sides, just being able to think about how important this can be as an area in terms of how we think about ourselves.
So let me expand a little bit on why is it really useful specifically for employees who are living with a chronic health condition. Now, one point to really be clear on here is that when it comes to using evidence-based coaching methods as a coaching psychologist, there is an element here of stay in your lane. So what we're not doing is getting into the chronic health condition itself, giving advice about that. It's giving someone the skills so they can navigate situations while they are living with this health condition. And that is why acceptance and commitment coaching is so useful. First of all, if someone's living with one of these conditions, they may not experience or be able to experience a reduction in their symptoms that is meaningful, that really is significant. But we're not focused on that. We're focused on helping them do more of the things that are a priority to them in life. Now, it may be that the more values aligned our behavior is, the less we're paying attention to that inner voice that says, I can, I can't, or I'll never do this, or but we're focusing on enabling them to do what really matters to them, not having a direct impact on the condition itself. One of the other skills that we develop as part of this, as Rachel said, is present moment awareness, focusing on here and now. That is really useful because if we go mentally time traveling to a difficult past or an anxiety-ridden future, we can feel those emotions now. It can take us away from what we're trying to do now, and it can really limit our behavioral options as we see them because that could happen, that could happen. So actually, what's happening now? How am I experiencing life right now? That's really beneficial because then you take the cues from the environment you're actually in, not the imagined one, and you behave accordingly. One way that I know that clients really benefit from this is that it's our focus on their direction of travel, not reaching big, scary goals, but actually moving in the direction of values, even if it's a baby step, even if it's a tiny adjustment, you're moving towards what matters. So we're not saying pass, fail, good, bad, success, failure. We're saying in the direction of what's really meaningful to you. Now, goal setting can be helpful, but Rachel and I have had extensive conversations about this sort of dark side of goal setting. And actually, it can be unhelpful. So, actually, emphasizing towards is a really nice way of putting that. And when we practice and help people develop this skill that we call cognitive diffusion, ending that struggle, they're less caught up with and battling thoughts about themselves and others and what others think of them, and more focused on doing the stuff that's aligned with their values. Less time wasted up here. And what uncomfortable thoughts and feelings might we have that we need and where we can find it useful to accept? It's going to be embarrassing, potentially humiliating to sit down with my manager and ask for some flexibility about this. So if I don't want that embarrassment, I don't have the conversation. No embarrassment, no conversation. It's all good. But that's not moving me forward. So actually accepting that it could be embarrassing, but what's much more important is that I do something that matters. And so people who have increased their psychological flexibility are doing more of the stuff that really matters to them, even if it's uncomfortable on a temporary basis. And we all know what it's like to have a difficult conversation, be embarrassed, get something wrong, be the focus in the limelight for a few minutes. And we're, as we've just said, we're able to cultivate a fuller appreciation of all the things that make us who we are and not zone in on either limitations placed on us by our condition or just the badge that might come with having a condition like this. So when we have developed this psychological flexibility, this capacity, it lowers levels of distress. So it reduces the amount of interference that the condition can have in someone's experience of life. That's really important. Really, really important. And it improves daily functioning because what they're focused on is the here and now. What's important, not 10 years from now, not the past, not maybe the thoughts about what other people are thinking, but what's in their control and what matters to them. So it is a very useful capacity to develop in individuals.
I think one thing that's really helpful to just reiterate again is that this is not about people with health conditions kind of overextending themselves and forcing themselves to things. This is much more about really thinking about what are the resources that I need, what are the things that I need or want to do, and how can I best get there. So there's a really strong sense of what is sustainable, what is manageable. This is not about people stepping towards things that are beyond what they can do. And I think that's really important as well, because sometimes when we talk about psychological flexibility, it can feel a bit scary. And it's like, I don't know what this is going to look or feel like. But I really think, one of the core things we often talk about is helping to make better decisions about what's workable and what's workable longer term as well. So I just wanted
Yeah.
to emphasize that point again, that this is about sustainability. It's about being able to reach your potential more effectively, being able to contribute more effectively, and helping organizations to see what do those environments look like? How can they help to support individuals more effectively?
And I think something that points to that really importantly is when we have a better appreciation of the flexibility of our self-concept, all the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, and we're clear on what matters to us in life, we get a sense of authenticity that can be really beneficial. So we don't necessarily live up to someone else's expectations or do things under social pressure. We do what matters to us because we know it's important to us and it contributes to our sense of purpose and meaning, which is super important.
Exactly.
So let me just wrap up with a summary of the ways that we can and do help our client organizations. I mean, we'll be talking about this later in the year, but giving strategic guidance and support around well-being, full stop, the provision of well-being focused coaching. And this isn't just for employees with chronic health conditions, but we've illustrated today how that can be really helpful. Do a lot of training of managers in how to have these kinds of conversations, how to instill a sense of psychological safety locally and cultivate that, and awareness of the different ways that well-being can be challenged, all the way from those little illnesses that take us out for a day or two through to the things that people are living with. One of the things I'm going to cover in the Thrive at Work campaign a little bit later, I'm jumping all over the place, I know, but it's just occurred to me we're going to have a podcast episode about menopause. Now, menopause is not a chronic illness. Menopause is a condition, an experience that 50% of humans will experience. And yet, who talks about it? Who accounts for that experience? How is flexibility given or not given? It's a bit of a shambles. So I really want to raise the conversation around that as well. We can, of course, design and run well-being programs, but it's through the lens of what works, evidence-based stuff, and enable managers to cultivate the coaching skills that mean they can have coaching style conversations with their team members, even if difficult topics like this pop up. And you may have seen it mentioned online elsewhere. I think I've been banging the drum. I'm running an event on September the 18th in Edinburgh about what works when it comes to well-being in the workplace. And I've shared the link to that on LinkedIn and various other places. But do reach out to me if you'd like to know more about it, because it sort of encapsulates what we're talking about here. Well-being is a huge topic. What actually can work, and how can an organization be a bit more evidence-based to ensure they're targeting the right things with the right methods and being as inclusive as we've been talking about this morning. I'd love to hear from anyone if you've got questions, if you'd like to drop them into the webinar chat or comments or examples from your own experience that you would like to share. While you're having a think about that, I'll just reiterate, we'll be sharing the recording of this on the YouTube channel, and I'll share that online wherever you've found this. And I'll be reaching out via email with the resources from this. Uh, First question through that, without experiencing it, it can be hard, especially for beginners like me, to make sense of ACT coaching, ending internal struggle, flexibility and self-concept, helpful phrases for getting underneath what ACT means. Uh,
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I think what's really important, but also what's really useful with this approach is that you can be flexible and creative. We've got core processes we're trying to work with, but the terminology we use needs to meet the needs of the person in front of us. And we're not doing something to them. And as Rachel mentioned earlier, we can be so creative with the acceptance and the cognitive diffusion component of this in terms of bringing it alive for the person. Rachel, what do you think about that?
Well, firstly, James, thank you for the comment. It's one that I think is really relevant. And actually, I think sometimes, as somebody who has tried many, many times to create, training and explanations for ACT and, ACT coaching, and, it's really difficult. I think people really get it when they experience it. That's what I think, is that I can sit and say to my coaching clients, this is what we're doing. This is how you're going to feel. Because a lot of those, the descriptions that we're using are trying to get a sense of how it feels, that feeling of internal struggle and that feeling of kind of feeling flexible about how you think about yourself. But actually, when you experience it, it's totally different. So one of the things we notice about doing acceptance and commitment coaching is there is a desire to try and make it experiential for people, that we're not going to get into these big wordy conversations. We're just going to try and do the work. And I think that's one of the things that is so wonderful about it. But unfortunately for practitioners, it means it can be a little bit of a challenge to get across what that feeling is until you experience it yourself.
So we're back to the challenge that I bang on about regularly for all of us as humans, the difference between knowing and doing. You
Mhm.
can know and understand this stuff, which is great, but until it's put into practice, even in tiny ways, we don't get the benefits from that, and we don't get that authentic connection with this stuff. And that applies at an organizational level as well. We can know that it's important to be aware of chronic health conditions, but what are we going to do about that to build in this flexibility, these accommodations? Ask people what they need rather than deciding in a remote way.
Wanted to make a final point, which is one thing I don't think that we've mentioned yet, which is how difficult this can be for both managers and HR teams, internal teams, to really address this in a way that feels like they are doing the job that they would want to do, doing this in a way that is a values connected way. I sometimes notice that managers, they don't want to, they don't want to do anything wrong, they don't want to upset somebody, and they don't want to kind of trigger somebody. So I think being able to support managers and help them to build their confidence to have these kinds of conversations is really worthwhile. Similarly, I think sometimes when you talk to HR or other central teams about how do you do this across an organization, that can feel very, very difficult because you want to make the environment equal for everybody. So I think being able to think about inclusivity and what this means, what this can look like, what reasonable adjustments might be workable, versus unworkable. And I think, again, we're not just saying here that an employee asks for something and automatically gets it. There's a conversation about what is workable both for the business and for the individual. So I think these are conversations that it can sometimes be helpful to be able, to have that willingness to step into something that feels a little bit, maybe I'm not sure about how this is going to work, or I'm not sure about, whether or not this is going to be a difficult conversation to have. I think just acknowledging that is worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We've hit the buffers on time, so I'm going to wrap up by saying thank you. Please feel free to get in touch with your questions in the next few weeks. Reach out to us on any of the ways you're in touch with us already. I'll be sharing all of these resources, and if you're watching this recording on YouTube, do feel free to pop your questions and comments in the space below. But for now, thanks so much, and have a great rest of your day.